The rain poured heavily, soaking the thin fabric of her worn-out hoodie as she stood at the bus stop, shivering. Her son clung to her, his small body trembling against the cold. Her heart pounded as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her last crumpled dollar. It was all she had. A man stood a few feet away looking down at his shoes. He was drenched, shivering just as much as she was. His clothes were tattered, his beard unkempt, and his eyes carried a sadness she knew too well. She didn't know his story, but she didn't need to. She walked up to him, extending her hand. "Here, sir. You look like you need this more than I do." The man hesitated, staring at her in disbelief. His lips trembled as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Slowly he reached out and took the dollar. His fingers brushed hers, cold, fragile. He looked at her, really looked at her. And in that moment, something shifted in his gaze. Something deep, something unreadable. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. She smiled weakly, stepping back to her son. The bus finally arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As she stepped onto it, she glanced back at the man, wondering what would become of him. Little did she know the man she had just given her last dollar to was a millionaire, one who was about to change her life forever. That morning had started like any other. Sophia Evans woke up to the sound of her son coughing. She sat up quickly, brushing her hand against his forehead. He was warm. Too warm. Her stomach sank. "Mommy, I don't feel good," Noah murmured, his small voice weak. She swallowed the panic rising in her throat. She couldn't afford for him to get sick, not now. Not when she was already 2 months behind on rent and barely scraping by. "Okay, baby," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's get you some medicine, all right?" Noah nodded, his little face pale as he curled up under the blankets. Sophia dressed quickly, pulling on the same jeans she had worn the day before. She checked her wallet. $1. That was it. No savings. No emergency fund. Just one single crumpled dollar. She sighed. If she could just make it to the diner, maybe she could get her paycheck early. But first she needed to drop Noah off at school. As they walked, Noah clutched her hand tightly. The wind was sharp, biting through their thin jackets. "Mommy, I'm hungry," he whispered. Sophia's chest tightened. "I know, baby. We'll eat soon, okay?" At the school, she kissed his forehead and watched him walk inside. She forced herself to smile until he disappeared through the doors. Only then did she let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. She had to figure something out. She rushed to the diner, her heart pounding. As soon as she walked in, her boss, Linda, frowned. "Sophia, I told you, paychecks don't go out until Friday. Please, Linda," she begged. "Just half of it. I need to get my son some medicine." Linda sighed, glancing away. "I'm sorry, but I can't make exceptions." Sophia nodded slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. She turned and walked out, her legs feeling weak. As she stepped outside, the sky darkened. The first raindrops fell, cold and heavy. She had nothing left, no money, no plan, nothing. She made her way to the bus stop, wrapping her arms around herself. The rain grew heavier, soaking her to the bone. And that was when she saw him, the man who looked just as lost as she felt. His clothes were ragged, his face hollow. He sat hunched over, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He didn't ask for anything. He just sat there, looking like the world had forgotten him. Something inside her stirred. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing against the $1 bill. It was all she had. But she couldn't just walk away. Her feet moved before her brain could stop them. She stood in front of him, hesitating for just a moment before extending the dollar. "Here," she said softly. His head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. He hesitated, then slowly took it, his hands shaking. "Thank you," he whispered. Sophia nodded, stepping back. The bus arrived and she climbed on, gripping Noah's hand. As they drove away, she looked back one last time. The man was still standing there, staring at the dollar in his hand. She had no idea that this one act of kindness was about to change everything. That night, Sophia lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Noah was asleep beside her, his small body curled up against hers. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she ignored it. Tomorrow she'd find a way. She always did. Meanwhile, miles away, the man she had given her last dollar to sat in a dimly lit hotel room. The dollar bill rested on the table in front of him. He ran his fingers over it, deep in thought. He had been searching for something. Someone who still believed in kindness even when they had nothing. And tonight he had found her. He picked up his phone, dialing a number. "I found her," he said. The voice on the other end paused. "Are you sure?" "Yes," the man replied, staring at the dollar. "And she has no idea what's coming next." Sophia woke up to the sound of coughing. Noah was curled up next to her, his little body shivering under the thin blanket. She touched his forehead. It was burning. Her heart clenched. She needed medicine. She needed food. But she had no money. She sat up slowly, her mind racing. Maybe she could borrow a few dollars from a neighbor. Maybe the diner would let her work an extra shift. Maybe. Her phone buzzed. She grabbed it, hoping it was good news. It wasn't. It was a text from her landlord. "You have until the end of the week. No more extensions." Sophia swallowed hard, closing her eyes. This couldn't be happening. She glanced at Noah, who was watching her with tired eyes. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't have to. He already knew. Forcing a smile, she ruffled his hair. "I'll be right back, sweetheart. Try to rest, okay?" He nodded weakly and she pulled on her jacket, stepping outside into the chilly morning air. She walked down the street, her mind spinning. She had to think of something, fast. At the diner, she pushed open the door, her breath coming out in small clouds. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and for a moment, her stomach growled. Linda glanced up from behind the counter. "Sophia, I told you." "I know," Sophia said quickly. "But I'm not asking for my paycheck. Just, do you have any extra food? Something that's going to be thrown out?" Linda's expression softened, but she shook her head. "I'm sorry, honey. Health regulations." Sophia forced a smile. "I understand." She turned to leave, trying to ignore the burning in her eyes. Just as she stepped outside, she bumped into someone. "Art." She stumbled back, gasping. "I'm so sorry," she started, then froze. It was him. The man from last night. Only, he didn't look the same. He was cleaned up. His beard was trimmed, and instead of ragged clothes, he wore a crisp button-up shirt and a dark coat. He looked different, but his eyes were the same. "Excuse me," he said, smiling slightly. "I believe I owe you $1. Sophia blinked. "What?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out the same crumpled dollar bill she had given him. "Last night," he said, "you gave me this. It was all you had, wasn't it?" Sophia's face grew hot. She didn't want to admit it. "It was just $1, she mumbled, looking away. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "No, it wasn't." He held the dollar between his fingers, looking at it thoughtfully. "This," he said, "was a test." Sophia frowned. "A test?" The man studied her for a moment before sighing. "Walk with me." She hesitated. She didn't know this man, but something about him. She nodded. They walked in silence for a while. Then the man spoke. "My name is James." Sophia glanced at him. "Nice to meet you, James." "You don't recognize me, do you?" he asked. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Should I?" James smiled. "Probably not. But you will soon." Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. Who was this man? And what did he mean? James stopped walking and turned to face her. "You have no idea what's about to happen to you, Sophia." Sophia's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" she whispered. James smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." Meanwhile, back at the diner, Linda stood by the window watching them walk away. She frowned, her hands gripping the counter. She knew exactly who James was. And she had a feeling Sophia's life was about to change forever. Sophia's heart pounded as she walked beside James. Something about this man unsettled her, not in a dangerous way but in a way that made her feel like she had just stepped into something far bigger than she understood. "What do you mean I'll find out soon?" she asked cautiously. James chuckled. "Let's just say, fate has a way of rewarding those who are kind, even when they have nothing to give." Sophia frowned. "That's not why I gave you the dollar." "I know." His voice was quiet. "And that's why it matters." They kept walking until they reached the park. James motioned toward a bench, and Sophia hesitated before sitting down. She didn't have time for this. Noah was sick, she had no money, and she was still trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads. "I don't mean to be rude, James, but I really need to get back to my son," she said, standing up. "I have a lot going on right now." James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I know. And that's why I want to give you this. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as he handed it to her. What is this? She asked, staring at the envelope. Open it. Her hands shook as she peeled it open. Inside was a thick wad of cash. More money than she had seen in years. Her mind couldn't even process the amount. She gasped, looking up at him. I can't take this. James smiled. Yes, you can. Tears burned her eyes. What? Why are you doing this? James leaned back against the bench, watching her. Because you were willing to give when you had nothing. That tells me everything I need to know about you. Sophia swallowed hard. Her fingers gripped the money tightly, but her heart screamed that this was too good to be true. No one just gives money away like this, she whispered. James smirked. You did. Her breath hitched. She stammered, shaking her head. This feels wrong. Like a trick. James sighed. I understand why you feel that way. But I promise you this isn't a trick. She hesitated, her mind battling between desperation and suspicion. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash. Sophia's head snapped toward the street, and her blood turned to ice. A car had run a red light, slamming into another vehicle. And that second car. Her heart stopped. It was heading straight for them. Move! James shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her backward. The car skidded onto the sidewalk, smashing into the bench they had been sitting on just seconds before. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the sound of screaming filled the air. Sophia hit the ground hard, her breath knocked from her lungs. James landed beside her, shielding her as debris rained down. For a moment there was only silence. Then distant sirens. Sophia gasped for air, her body shaking as she looked at the wreckage. If they had still been sitting there. She turned to James, her heart racing. That could have been us. James looked at the wreckage, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to her. Now do you believe in fate? Hours later, Sophia sat on her couch, staring at the envelope of money on the table. The events of the day felt unreal. The car accident. The money. James. Who was he? And why did she feel like this was only the beginning? Noah stirred beside her, coughing softly. She brushed his hair back, her heart aching. The money could help. She could buy food, medicine, maybe even pay off part of the rent. But something about it still scared her. What if it came with strings? What if this was some kind of trap? And most importantly, why did James seem so certain that her life was about to change? Sophia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the thick wad of cash in the envelope. It felt heavy in her hands, like it carried more than just money, like it carried questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. She ran her fingers over the bills, her heart pounding. Noah coughed in his sleep, and just like that, all of her hesitation melted away. She grabbed her jacket and shoved the money into her pocket. She needed to get medicine. The nearest pharmacy was a 15-minute walk. She barely noticed the cold air biting at her skin as she made her way down the dark streets. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened that day. James. The accident. The money. Who was he? Why had he been homeless one night and then dressed like a businessman the next? And how did he know that her life was about to change? She shook the thoughts from her head as she reached the pharmacy. The automatic doors slid open, and the bright lights made her eyes sting. She grabbed a bottle of children's cough syrup and a small pack of fever medicine. Then she hesitated. She had money now. Enough to buy real food. Her stomach clenched as she walked toward the grocery section, picking up a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small container of milk. Nothing fancy. Just enough to get them through the next few days. When she got to the register, the cashier, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave her a sympathetic smile. Long night. Sophia nodded. Something like that. The woman rang up her items, and for the first time in months, Sophia didn't feel the crushing anxiety of wondering if her card would decline. She paid in cash. It felt unreal. As she walked back home, she clutched the bag tightly. This money had saved her. But why did she still feel like something was off? She turned the corner onto her street and immediately stopped. A man stood outside her apartment building. Not James. Someone else. He was tall, dressed in all black, and standing perfectly still near the entrance. Sophia's pulse quickened. Who was he? And why was he watching her apartment? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep walking. Maybe he was just a neighbor. Maybe she was being paranoid. But as she reached the entrance, the man turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the sharp glint of his eyes beneath the streetlight. He knew she had seen him. Sophia hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she set the grocery bag on the counter. She peeked out the window. The man was still there. Just standing. Watching. Her stomach twisted. Something was happening. And she had a feeling that James wasn't the only one keeping secrets. The next morning, Noah was feeling a little better. Sophia made him eggs and toast, watching as he nibbled at the food with more energy than he'd had in days. "Mommy, can we go to the park later?" he asked, his voice still raspy but hopeful. She smiled, brushing his hair back. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. You need to rest today." Noah pouted but didn't argue. Sophia glanced out the window. The man was gone. Had she imagined it? Was she just being paranoid? A knock at the door made her jump. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a slow breath before opening the door. James stood there holding 2 coffee cups. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "I thought you could use this." Sophia stared at him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." James walked in, looking around the small apartment. "Cozy." Sophia crossed her arms. "You knew, didn't you?" James raised an eyebrow. "Knew what?" "That I was being watched last night." James sighed, setting the coffee cups on the table. "Yes." Sophia's stomach dropped. "Who was he?" James hesitated. And that's when she knew. This was bigger than she had realized. "You're in the middle of something, aren't you?" she whispered. James exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Sophia, I need you to trust me. And I need you to be careful." Sophia's hands clenched into fists. "Careful of what?" James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There are people who don't want me helping you," he said quietly. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Helping me with what, James?" He stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Changing your life." Sophia's fingers curled around the edge of the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Changing my life?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does that even mean, James?" James set his coffee down, exhaling slowly. His expression had changed, no longer playful, no longer teasing. He was serious. "It means that what happened last night wasn't random. The money, the accident, the man outside your apartment, they're all connected." Sophia's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. James leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I told you I'm not just some random guy you gave $1 to. I was testing something. I've been looking for someone like you." Sophia took a step back. "Looking for someone like me?" James nodded. "Someone who still believes in kindness even when they have nothing. Someone who gives without expecting anything in return." Sophia shook her head. "That doesn't explain the man outside my apartment." "Who was he?" James's jaw tightened. "Someone who doesn't want me to help you." Sophia felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Why?" she asked. James hesitated. "Because they know what happens when I choose someone. They know that when I decide to change a person's life, it can shift everything." Sophia's hands were shaking. "You keep saying that, but you're not telling me why. Why do you have so much money? Why were you pretending to be homeless? Who are these people watching me?" James rubbed his temples. "I can't tell you everything yet." Sophia let out a bitter laugh. "Of course you can't." James sighed. "Sophia, listen to me. I need you to trust me." Sophia's chest tightened. She thought about Noah, still curled up in bed. She thought about how the money in the envelope had saved her last night. And she thought about the man standing outside her apartment, watching her in the dark. She had no choice but to trust James. At least for now. She swallowed hard. "Fine. But if you're not going to give me answers, then at least tell me this. Am I in danger?" James held her gaze. "Not yet," he said. Sophia's stomach twisted. "Not yet." James stood up. "I need to go for now, but I'll be back. Just be careful. If you see anything strange, call me." Sophia crossed her arms. "I don't have your number." James smiled slightly, pulling a small white card from his pocket. He slid it across the table. A single number was printed on it. Nothing else. No name. No business. Just a number. Sophia picked it up, running her fingers over the paper. "When will you be back?" she asked. James hesitated, then said, "Soon." With that, he turned and walked out the door. Sophia locked it behind him, leaning her forehead against the wood. Her life had been falling apart just yesterday. Now she was standing in the middle of something she didn't understand. She turned the card over in her hands, staring at the number. Who was James? And what had she just gotten herself into? That night, Sophia barely slept. Every sound outside made her heart jump. She checked the window multiple times, searching for the man in black. But he never appeared. Maybe he was gone. Maybe he wasn't. Morning came too soon. Noah was feeling better, which was the only good news she had. She made him breakfast, real breakfast, thanks to the money James had given her. As Noah happily ate his eggs and toast, Sophia watched him, her mind racing. She couldn't just sit here and wait for answers. She needed to do something. James had said people didn't want him to help her. What? She pulled out her phone and hesitated before dialing the number on the card. She wasn't sure if James would even answer. But before she could press call, there was a knock at the door. Her breath caught. She glanced at Noah, who was humming to himself, completely unaware of the tension in the air. Slowly, she walked to the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Another knock. She swallowed hard. Who is it? No answer. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She looked through the peephole and froze. It wasn't James. It wasn't the man in black. It was someone she never expected to see again. Her ex, Brandon. She hadn't seen him in years. He wasn't supposed to know where she lived. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. What are you doing here? She whispered. Brandon smirked. Is that any way to greet me? Sophia's stomach churned. She had fought hard to keep him out of their lives. She tightened her grip on the door. What do you want? Brandon leaned against the frame, his eyes dark. I heard you came into some money. Sophia's breath caught. How did he know? She gritted her teeth. I don't know what you're talking about. Brandon chuckled. Come on, sophomore. You really think I wouldn't hear about it? Sophia's hands shook. James had warned her. People didn't want him to help her. And now, Brandon was here. Her past had just come knocking. And she had no idea what was coming next. Sophia's fingers tightened around the doorframe. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Brandon shouldn't be here. He wasn't supposed to know where she lived. He wasn't supposed to know anything about her life. Yet here he was, standing outside her apartment with that smug grin she remembered too well. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. Come on, sophomore, don't play dumb with me. She swallowed hard. How did you find me? Brandon raised an eyebrow. Does it matter? Yes, it mattered a lot. Sophia shifted her weight, angling her body slightly to block his view inside the apartment. The last thing she wanted was for him to see Noah. I don't have time for this, she muttered, moving to close the door. Brandon's hand shot out, stopping it. Sophia's breath caught. Now, he said smoothly. No need to be rude. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Brandon had always been like this, charming, smooth-talking. But underneath that charm was something darker. Something dangerous. She had fought to escape him once. And now he was back. Let go of the door, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Brandon smirked. Relax. I just want to talk. I have nothing to say to you. Brandon leaned in slightly. His voice dropped. You sure about that? Because I think you do. Sophia's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Brandon wasn't just here to bother her. He wanted something. You got money out of nowhere, he continued. That's interesting, isn't it? You're always broke and suddenly you're out buying groceries, paying for medicine. Sophia's blood ran cold. He's been watching me. Her fingers clenched into fists. Stay away from me, Brandon. Brandon laughed under his breath. Oh, come on, sweetheart. You know me better than that. I know exactly who you are. That's why I don't want you here. Brandon tilted his head. I think we both know you don't really have a choice. Sophia's breath hitched. What does that mean? Brandon sighed dramatically. It means that if you're suddenly swimming in cash, someone must have given it to you. And people don't just give money away, Sophia. They want something in return. Sophia's stomach churned. Brandon knew something. But how? And who else knew? She glanced at her phone on the table. She could call James. But would he even answer? Brandon leaned against the doorframe, watching her closely. I bet you don't even know who you're dealing with. Sophia swallowed hard. She didn't. James had been vague, cryptic. She had felt something was off, but she hadn't questioned it. Now she was realizing. Maybe she should have. Brandon tapped his fingers against the doorframe. Here's what's gonna happen, sophomore. You're gonna let me in, we're gonna have a little chat, and you're gonna tell me exactly where this money came from. Sophia clenched her jaw. Not happening. Brandon sighed, shaking his head. See, that's a problem. Because if you don't tell me, I might have to ask someone else. Her blood turned to ice. No. Her hand shot out before she could think. She shoved Brandon hard, making him stumble back. She slammed the door and locked it. Bang. Brandon hit the door with his fist. Sophia, he called, his voice turning sharp. You don't want to do this. She stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. Another bang. You think locking the door changes anything? He taunted. I will find out what's going on. And if you don't tell me? He let the threat hang in the air. Sophia's throat tightened. She had to get out of here. But where could she go? She grabbed her phone with shaking fingers and dialed the number James had given her. Rang. Once. Twice. Then. Click. You need to come. Now, she whispered, her voice trembling. There was silence on the other end. Then James's voice, low and calm. Where are you? Home, she breathed. He's here. Brandon is here. James cursed under his breath. Lock the doors. Don't let him in. I'm on my way. Sophia hung up, pressing her back against the door. Outside, Brandon laughed. You think that phone call is gonna save you? He called through the door. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed James would get here before it was too late. 20 minutes passed. Brandon was still outside. He hadn't left. He was waiting. Noah had woken up, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Mommy, what's wrong? Sophia forced a smile. Nothing, sweetheart. Just stay here, okay? Noah nodded, but he kept watching her, like he knew something wasn't right. Then, a car pulled up outside. Sophia rushed to the window. James stepped out, his face unreadable. Brandon saw him. And for the first time, Brandon's smug expression faltered. James walked toward him slowly, hands in his pockets, completely calm. Brandon straightened, trying to act tough. Who the hell are you? James stopped a few feet away, tilting his head. You're in my way. Brandon scoffed. Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it? James smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't kind. It was dangerous. You don't want to find out, James said quietly. Brandon hesitated. For the first time since he'd shown up, he looked unsure. James took a slow step forward. Brandon took a slow step back. Something unspoken passed between them. Then Brandon huffed, shaking his head. This isn't over, Sophia, he muttered. He turned and walked off. Sophia watched him disappear down the street, her breath shaking. James knocked on the door. She opened it, her body still tense. You okay? He asked. She exhaled shakily. No. James studied her. Then he stepped inside and closed the door. You need to leave, he said. Sophia's stomach dropped. What? James met her eyes. It's not just Brandon, he said. More people are watching you. And if you stay here, you won't be safe. Sophia's pulse pounded. Leave. Go where? James took a step closer. You need to trust me, he said. Because from this point forward. His voice dropped. Your life will never be the same again. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had barely processed what had just happened with Brandon, and now James was standing in front of her, telling her she had to leave. Leave? She echoed. James, I can't just pick up and go. I have a child. James's expression was unreadable. I know. Then you know I can't just run, she said, shaking her head. I have nowhere to go. I don't even understand what's happening. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Listen, Sophia. I was hoping we had more time, but we don't. Brandon isn't the only one watching you. If he knows about the money, that means others do too. And if you stay here, you won't just be in danger. Noah will be too. Sophia's stomach clenched. Noah. She glanced toward the small bedroom where her son was playing with his stuffed animals, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside their tiny apartment. She turned back to James, her voice shaking. Where are we supposed to go? James studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small key. I have a place, he said. It's safe. No one will find you there. Sophia stared at the key in his palm. This was crazy. How had her life gone from struggling to buy medicine for Noah to being told she had to go into hiding? She had no reason to trust James. And yet, something inside her whispered that he was telling the truth. She swallowed hard. How do I know I can trust you? James met her eyes. You don't, he admitted. But if you stay here, Brandon will come back. And next time he won't be alone. Sophia's chest tightened. She thought of the way Brandon had looked at her, the way he had smirked, knowing he had the upper hand. She thought of the man in black from the other night, standing under the streetlight, just watching. She thought of Noah. Her hands clenched into fists. James was right. She had no choice. Sophia took a deep breath and nodded. Okay. James's expression softened. Get a bag. Only essentials. We leave in 10 minutes. Sophia rushed to Noah's room, grabbing his backpack and stuffing it with clothes. She grabbed a few of her own things, her heart pounding with every second that passed. This was really happening. She was leaving everything behind. Again. 10 minutes later, they were in James's car, driving away from the apartment. Sophia kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Brandon's car tailing them. But the streets were empty. For now. Noah sat in the back seat holding his stuffed rabbit. Where are we going, Mommy? Sophia forced a smile. On an adventure, sweetheart. James glanced at her but said nothing. They drove for over an hour, leaving the city behind. The roads became quieter, the buildings turned to trees. Finally, James pulled off onto a small dirt road, surrounded by dense forest. Sophia frowned. Where are we? James didn't answer. He kept driving until they reached a small cabin, hidden behind thick trees. Sophia stared at it. You want us to stay here? She asked. It's safe, James said simply. Sophia sighed, stepping out of the car. Noah followed, holding her hand as they walked toward the cabin. James unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside it was surprisingly clean. There was a couch, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. 2 bedrooms. Sophia looked around. This isn't what I expected. James smirked. What did you expect? A bunker? She gave him a look. Honestly? Maybe. James chuckled but then turned serious. This place isn't connected to me in any way. No one will find you here. Sophia's stomach twisted. But why are people looking for me, James? What aren't you telling me? James hesitated. And then, a loud thump came from outside. Sophia's heart stopped. James's expression darkened. Stay here, he said, his voice low. He moved toward the door, reaching into his coat. Sophia grabbed Noah and pulled him close, her heart racing. James cracked the door open. And then he moved fast. Too fast. In the blink of an eye, he was gone. Sophia barely had time to react before she heard the sound of struggling outside. A sharp grunt. A thud. Then silence. Her body tensed. She wanted to run. But she needed to know. Clutching Noah's hand, she crept to the door and peeked outside. Her breath hitched. James stood over a man, one of the same men in black from the other night. The man wasn't moving. James looked up, meeting her eyes. Now do you believe me? He asked. Sophia swallowed hard. She didn't know what she believed anymore. But one thing was clear. She had just stepped into something far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the unmoving man on the ground. James stood over him, his expression unreadable, his stance calm, too calm. What did you do? She whispered. James knelt beside the man, checking his pulse. He's alive. For now. Sophia's stomach twisted. Who is he? James exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The kind of person who doesn't knock before showing up. He pulled a phone from the man's pocket and scrolled through it. His face darkened. This is bad, he muttered. Sophia clutched Noah tighter. How bad? James looked up, his eyes sharp. They know where you are. Sophia's chest tightened. I thought you said this place was safe. It was, James snapped. Until now. Sophia's hands shook. She had thought they had gotten away. That for the first time in years she and Noah were safe. But they weren't. They never had been. James stood, dragging the unconscious man toward the back of the cabin. Stay inside, he ordered. Sophia didn't move. James? Inside now. His voice was sharp. Cold. It wasn't a request. Sophia swallowed hard and pulled Noah back into the cabin, locking the door behind her. Her mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want? And why did James keep acting like this was bigger than just her? Noah tugged on her sleeve. Mommy, I'm scared. She forced a smile, kneeling beside him. I know, baby. But everything is going to be okay. It wasn't a promise. It was a lie. Because deep down, Sophia knew. Nothing would ever be okay again. 20 minutes passed. Sophia paced the small living room, her ears straining for any sound outside. Finally, the door creaked open. James stepped in, wiping his hands on his jacket. Sophia's stomach twisted. What did you do with him? James shut the door behind him. Let's just say he won't be making any phone calls. Sophia's mouth went dry. James? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't kill him if that's what you're asking. That was what she was asking. Sophia swallowed hard. Who was he? James hesitated. Then he leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. His name is Gregor. He works for someone I used to be involved with. Sophia frowned. Involved with? You mean like business? James's jaw tightened. Something like that. Sophia shook her head. No more cryptic answers, James. I deserve to know what's going on. James studied her for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. You were never supposed to be in the middle of this, he admitted. When I found you, I was looking for someone. Someone kind. Someone real. I wanted to prove something. Sophia crossed her arms. Prove what? James hesitated. Then, a sharp ringing filled the air. Sophia flinched. It wasn't her phone. It was James's. He pulled it from his pocket, his face darkening when he saw the number. Sophia's pulse quickened. Who is it? James didn't answer. He let it ring for a few more seconds before finally answering. He put it on speaker. A voice crackled through the line, deep and smooth. James. It's been a while. Sophia's stomach twisted. James's fingers tightened around the phone. You shouldn't be calling this number. The voice chuckled. And yet here we are. You didn't think I wouldn't find her, did you? Sophia's heart slammed against her ribs. Find her. They were talking about her. James's expression darkened. She has nothing to do with this. Oh, but she does now, the voice said smoothly. You made sure of that when you gave her the money. Sophia's breath hitched. James clenched his jaw. If you touch her. Relax, the voice interrupted. I don't want to hurt her. I just want to talk. James laughed coldly. Like hell you do. The voice sighed. Look, James. You know how this works. You made your choice, but that doesn't mean she's off limits. You owe me. Sophia's blood ran cold. James owes him? James's entire body was tense. I don't owe you anything. The voice chuckled. We both know that's not true. So here's what's going to happen. You bring her to me and this doesn't have to get ugly. Sophia felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. James's voice dropped to a dangerous level. If you come near her, I'll end you myself. Silence. Then. Tick-tock, James. You know I always get what I want. The line went dead. Sophia felt frozen. James slowly lowered the phone, his expression unreadable. She swallowed hard. Who was that? James exhaled. His name is Victor. And if he knows where you are. He stopped. Sophia's hands shook. Then what? James met her gaze. Then you're running out of time. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. Running out of time. The words echoed in her head, sinking deep into her bones. She stared at James, her breath shaky. Tell me the truth, James. All of it. Who is Victor? And why does he want me? James exhaled, rubbing his face. He looked tired. Victor isn't just anyone, he said finally. He's dangerous. Powerful. The kind of man you don't want knowing your name. Sophia swallowed hard. And yet he does. James nodded grimly. Because of me. Sophia's stomach twisted. Why? James hesitated. Then he pulled out the same crumpled dollar bill she had given him that night. Sophia's breath hitched. You changed everything, he murmured. More than you know. Sophia shook her head, overwhelmed. That doesn't answer my question. James sighed, gripping the edge of the counter. Victor and I used to work together. A long time ago. Sophia frowned. Work? What kind of work? James's jaw tightened. The kind that made us both rich. Silence filled the cabin. Sophia's fingers curled into fists. You were criminals. James didn't deny it. Sophia felt like the room was spinning. And now he wants me because of you? James nodded. Because I walked away. And because I did something that he sees as a betrayal. Sophia's blood turned to ice. The money. James met her eyes. Yes. Sophia's breath shook. He gave you that money, didn't he? James exhaled. Not exactly. But he thinks it belongs to him. And when I gave it to you, that made you part of the equation. Sophia's stomach dropped. So now he wants it back. James's expression darkened. No. Now he wants you. Sophia's pulse pounded. Why? She whispered. James hesitated. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. Because to Victor, people aren't just people. They're leverage. Sophia felt sick. He didn't want her money. He wanted to use her. She stumbled back, gripping the wall for support. No. No, this isn't happening. James took a step forward. Sophia, listen to me. No, she snapped. I gave you $1. I was just trying to help someone who looked like they needed it. And now my son and I are being hunted. James's jaw clenched. I know this isn't fair. Fair? Sophia laughed bitterly. You dragged me into a war I didn't even know existed. James exhaled. I was trying to help you. Sophia's hands shook. Well, congratulations, James. Now I have a psychopath after me. James took another step closer. That's why I need you to trust me. Sophia shook her head. No. What I need is for this to end. James's eyes darkened. It won't. Sophia swallowed hard. What do you mean? James hesitated. Then he spoke the word she had been dreading. Victor won't stop until he gets what he wants. Sophia's throat tightened. And what does he want? James's expression turned grim. You. A heavy silence filled the room. Sophia's mind raced. She had been struggling to keep food on the table just days ago. Now she was being hunted by a man she had never met. A man James used to work for. A man who wanted her. She felt sick. How do we stop this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James hesitated. James, she pressed. Tell me. His expression was unreadable. Then finally, there's only one way, he said. Sophia swallowed hard. Which is? James exhaled. We have to take Victor down first. Sophia's blood ran cold. Take him down? She stared at James, trying to process what he had just said. You want to fight him? James met her gaze. It's the only way you'll ever be safe. Sophia shook her head. That's insane. He's powerful. You said he was dangerous. James nodded. Exactly. Which is why running won't work. No matter where you go, he'll find you. He always does. Sophia's stomach clenched. She wanted to scream. She wanted to wake up and realize this was all a nightmare. But it wasn't. She looked at Noah, who was sitting quietly on the couch, watching them with wide eyes. She had to protect him. No matter what. Sophia turned back to James. How? James studied her carefully. If we do this, you have to be all in. No second guessing. No running. No looking back. Sophia's pulse pounded. She had spent years surviving. Running. Hiding. But now, she was done being afraid. She took a deep breath. Then she met James's eyes and said the words that changed everything. Tell me what I have to do. James studied her, his eyes searching hers for hesitation. But there was none. Sophia's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She was terrified, she wouldn't deny that, but she would not let fear control her. Not anymore. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. All right, he said finally. If we're going to do this, we need a plan. Sophia nodded. Then let's make one. James smirked slightly, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her he wasn't used to people standing their ground like this. He liked control. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was hers too. He grabbed a chair and pulled it to the table, motioning for her to sit. Sophia hesitated, then did the same. Noah, still curled up on the couch, looked at them curiously. Mommy? He asked softly. Sophia glanced at James, then back at her son. Come here, baby. Noah climbed onto her lap, resting his head against her shoulder. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispering, Everything's going to be okay. Another lie. But she needed him to believe it. James cleared his throat. Victor is smart, he began. Smarter than most people give him credit for. If he knows we're coming for him, he'll be ready. Sophia frowned. Then we don't let him see us coming. James smiled slightly. Exactly. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. The screen lit up, showing a map with red dots scattered across it. Sophia frowned. What is this? Victor's properties, James explained. Safe houses, businesses, places he operates from. Sophia's stomach twisted. There are so many. James nodded. He doesn't stay in one place for long. But I know where he will be. Sophia swallowed hard. Where? James tapped on one of the red dots. This. A private estate just outside the city. He's holding a meeting there tomorrow night. If we move fast, we can get to him before he disappears again. Sophia's breath caught. Tomorrow night? James nodded. We don't have time to wait. The longer we do, the more people he sends after you. Sophia's heart pounded. This was happening. It wasn't some distant, hypothetical plan. It was real. James leaned forward. If we're going to do this, I need you to trust me completely. No hesitations. No doubts. Sophia clenched her jaw. I already said I'm in. James studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Then let's get to work. The next few hours were a blur. James moved with precision, pulling out weapons, gathering supplies, mapping out an entry plan. Sophia sat beside him, absorbing everything. This was not her world. But it was now. James handed her a small earpiece. Put this on tomorrow before we leave. We'll stay connected at all times. Sophia nodded. Then he placed a gun on the table. Her breath caught. She stared at it, her stomach twisting. James met her eyes. You don't have to use it. But if something goes wrong. She swallowed hard. I don't know how. James sighed, reaching for the gun. I'll teach you. Sophia's pulse pounded as he stood and motioned for her to follow him outside. She hesitated. Then she glanced at Noah, who was now asleep on the couch. James noticed. We won't be gone long, he assured her. Sophia took a shaky breath and followed him outside. The cold air hit her instantly. James walked a few steps ahead, stopping near a tree stump. He placed an empty can on top of it and handed her the gun. Sophia stared at it, then at him. He sighed. It's just a tool, Sophia. It won't do anything unless you make it. She swallowed hard and took it. It felt heavier than she expected. James moved behind her, guiding her hands. Grip it like this. Keep your stance firm. Don't flinch when you fire or you'll miss. Sophia exhaled shakily. I don't know if I can do this. James's voice was quiet. Then imagine what happens if you don't. Sophia clenched her jaw. Then she aimed. Her finger trembled over the trigger. She closed her eyes. No, she couldn't close her eyes. She opened them again and focused. Then she pulled the trigger. Bang. The can flew off the stump. Sophia's breath hitched. She had hit it. James smirked. Not bad. Sophia turned to him, still shaking. Not bad, she gasped. James, I just shot something. He chuckled. Yeah. And tomorrow you might have to shoot someone. Sophia's stomach twisted. She had known this was coming. But hearing it out loud made it real. James placed a hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think, Sophia. But if you want to protect your son, you have to be ready. Sophia's hands tightened around the gun. She had to be ready. For Noah. For herself. For everything. She took a deep breath and nodded. Then teach me. Sophia barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had fired a gun. She had agreed to take down a man she had never even met. And tomorrow she would walk into a place filled with danger, knowing she might not walk back out. She turned her head to look at Noah, curled up beside her. His small chest rose and fell steadily, his face peaceful in sleep. She reached out, brushing a curl from his forehead. I will keep you safe. She didn't care what it took. She would not let Victor take away the one thing that mattered most. Morning came too quickly. James was already up, gathering the last of their supplies. Eat something, he said without looking up. You'll need your strength. Sophia wasn't hungry. But she forced down a piece of toast anyway. Noah sat at the small table, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Mommy, are we going home today? Sophia's chest tightened. She forced a smile. Not yet, baby. But soon. James met her eyes from across the room. She wasn't sure if that was true. James pulled a sleek black bag onto the table and unzipped it. Inside were several firearms, stacks of cash, and a single set of blueprints. Sophia swallowed hard. What is that? James pulled out the blueprint and spread it across the table. Victor's estate, he said. This is where we'll find him. Sophia studied the map. It was massive, like something out of a movie. The estate was surrounded by a high fence, with security checkpoints at every entrance. How do we even get inside? She asked. James tapped a section of the blueprint. Here. A service entrance. It's the only way in without drawing attention. Sophia exhaled sharply. And once we're inside? James's jaw tightened. We find Victor. And we make sure he never comes after you again. Sophia's stomach twisted. You mean kill him? James didn't answer. But he didn't have to. Sophia clenched her fists. What if there's another way? James sighed. Sophia, this isn't a negotiation. Victor doesn't leave loose ends. If we don't stop him now, he'll never stop coming after you. Sophia looked at Noah. Then back at James. Her voice was quiet but firm. Then let's end this. The drive to the estate was tense. James had switched cars twice, making sure they weren't being followed. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, gripping her earpiece tightly. Noah was safe, back at the cabin with someone James trusted. But she still felt sick leaving him behind. James glanced at her. You okay? Sophia let out a humorless laugh. Not even a little bit. James smirked. That's normal. She turned to him. How do you do this? How do you just walk into something like this without falling apart? James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I've already lost everything once. I know what it feels like. And I won't let it happen again. Sophia frowned. Lost everything? James didn't respond. Sophia didn't push. Because before she could, he pulled the car to a stop. They were here. The estate was massive. A sprawling mansion with towering walls and guards stationed at every gate. Sophia's heart pounded as she and James slipped into the trees surrounding the property. James pressed a small earpiece into her hand. Put this in. No matter what happens, we stay connected. Sophia nodded, placing it in her ear. James crouched low, signaling for her to follow. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows. Sophia's palms were sweating. Her entire body was shaking. She wasn't built for this. She was just a mom. But she had no choice. James reached the service entrance first. A single guard stood outside, checking his phone. In a flash, James was behind him. A swift strike to the back of the head. The guard crumpled. Sophia's breath hitched. James caught her look. Focus, he whispered. We don't have time for second thoughts. She swallowed hard and nodded. They slipped inside. The hallway was dark and quiet. Sophia's heartbeat echoed in her ears. James led the way, his gun raised. Every step felt like an eternity. Then, a voice crackled in her earpiece. You're early, James. Sophia froze. James cursed under his breath. I must say, the voice continued, I didn't expect you to bring company. But I suppose I should have known. Sophia felt a chill crawl up her spine. It was him. Victor. James's expression was unreadable. Where are you, Victor? Victor chuckled. Oh, James. You don't need to find me. I'll find you. Sophia's breath caught. Then, the lights flickered. And the doors behind them slammed shut. A trap. It was a trap. Sophia turned to James, panic surging through her. What do we do? James's jaw clenched. We fight. Then, gunfire erupted. Sophia dropped to the floor as bullets ricocheted off the walls. James moved fast, returning fire. Sophia's hands trembled as she reached for her own gun. She could barely breathe. James grabbed her wrist. Stay with me. A guard charged toward them. Sophia raised her gun. And fired. Bang. The man dropped. Sophia's breath came in sharp gasps. She had just shot someone. James grabbed her arm. Sophia, move. She forced herself to her feet, running after James as they dodged through the hallway. They had to get to Victor. They had to end this. But as they turned the corner, Sophia froze. Because standing at the end of the hallway, a gun in his hand, was Brandon, her ex, and he was smiling. Hey, sweetheart, he drawled. Miss me? Sophia's stomach dropped. Her past and her present had just collided. And there was no way out. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Brandon. She had spent years running from him. And now here he was, standing between her and survival, gun in hand, smiling. "Brandon," she whispered, her pulse pounding. He tilted his head, amused. "You look surprised. What, you think I was just gonna disappear?" James moved slightly, raising his gun. Brandon sked, waving his weapon. "Ah, I wouldn't do that." More footsteps echoed behind them. Sophia's stomach twisted. They were surrounded. Victor had been waiting for them. And Brandon. He had been part of it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. James exhaled sharply. "You work for Victor." Brandon grinned. "Smart man. Took you long enough." Sophia clenched her fists. "You sold us out?" Brandon chuckled. "Oh, sweetheart. I was never on your side." Sophia's entire body shook with rage. Of course he wasn't. Brandon never changed. He had always been a parasite, feeding off her, using her, controlling her. And now he wanted to do it again. "You don't have to do this," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Brandon smirked. "That's where you're wrong." More men stepped into the hallway, surrounding them. Then, a new voice filled the air. Smooth. Calm. Deadly. "That's enough." Sophia's blood ran cold. She turned. And there he was. Victor. Tall. Refined. Dressed in a dark suit, not a hair out of place. His presence filled the space, suffocating. This was a man who owned the world. And now, he owned her fate. Sophia's throat tightened. Victor clasped his hands behind his back, studying her. "Sophia Evans. You've caused quite the mess, haven't you?" She swallowed hard. "I didn't ask for any of this." Victor smirked. "Oh, I know. James did that for you." His eyes flicked to James, who was glaring at him with pure hatred. Victor sighed dramatically. James. You disappoint me." James's jaw clenched. "I don't work for you anymore." Victor chuckled. "So I've heard. And yet here you are, trying to play the hero." Sophia's pulse thundered. She had to think, had to find a way out. Because she knew one thing for certain. Victor wasn't letting them leave. Victor exhaled. "Here's how this is going to work." He turned to Sophia. "You're coming with me." Sophia stiffened. "No." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Sophia swallowed hard, but she stood her ground. "No." Victor smirked. "I don't think you understand, Ms. Evans. This isn't a request." James took a step forward. "If you touch her." Victor held up a hand. "Oh, please. Spare me the threats. We all know how this ends." His eyes darkened. "She comes with me. Or I kill you both." Sophia's breath caught. Victor meant it. She could see it in his eyes. James's fingers twitched toward his gun. But there were too many of them. If he fired, they'd both die. Victor sighed, watching her. "Come now, Sophia. Be smart about this." Sophia's mind raced. She couldn't let Victor take her. She couldn't let him win. Her fingers curled into fists. And then, she made a decision. One that would change everything. She turned to Brandon. "You really think Victor's gonna let you walk away?" she asked. Brandon frowned. "What? You think you're his partner?" she pressed. "You're a tool. Just like everyone else. And the second you stop being useful." She glanced at Victor. Then back to Brandon. "He'll get rid of you." Brandon's grip on his gun tightened. Sophia saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Victor sighed. "Don't listen to her, Brandon." But it was too late. Brandon hesitated just for a second. And in that second, James moved. Fast. A gunshot rang out. Brandon staggered back, clutching his shoulder. James grabbed Sophia's wrist, pulling her behind him. Chaos erupted. Gunfire. Shouting. Sophia's heart pounded as James pulled her toward the side hallway. Victor's voice roared behind them. "Don't let them escape." James fired behind him, taking out 2 guards. Sophia's hands were shaking, but she kept running. They burst through a side door. And suddenly they were outside. Fresh air. Freedom. James yanked her toward the car. "Get in." Sophia threw herself inside as James slid into the driver's seat. Tires screeched. Bullets pinged off the car as they sped down the driveway. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps. They had done it. They had escaped. But Victor wasn't dead. And she knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. Days later. Sophia sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun rise. Noah was asleep inside. James stood beside her, silent. They had survived. But Victor was still out there. Waiting. Watching. Sophia exhaled. This isn't over, is it? James shook his head. No. Sophia looked at him. Then we end it. James smirked. I thought you'd say that. Sophia took a deep breath. She wasn't the same woman she had been a week ago. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. And this time, she would win.